In the early summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean was still a Japanese lake. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the rising sun seemed unstoppable. One island after another had fallen. The Philippines burned, Singapore had surrendered, and the U.S. Navy was bloodied and broken. Across the ocean, Japanese carriers prowled freely, their planes striking where they pleased. But deep within the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, America was rebuilding fast, silent, and furious. The story began with an island barely visible on most maps, Midway, a speck of coral halfway between Hawaii and Japan. To the Japanese, it was the key to breaking the American fleet for good. To the Americans, it was the thin line between survival and annihilation. And in June of that year, both sides would gamble everything upon it. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, planned to lure the U.S. carriers into a trap. His strategy was flawless on paper. Attack Midway, draw the Americans out to defend it, then crush them with overwhelming force. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, formed the heart of the Japanese armada. They carried over 200 aircraft, the same deadly strike force that had crippled Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. But unknown to Yamamoto, American intelligence had broken his code. In a dimly lit room in Hawaii, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his codebreakers at Station Hypo had deciphered Japan's next target. They learned that the enemy's AF meant Midway. With that single revelation, the tide of the war began to shift. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew this was America's one chance to strike back. His fleet was small, only 3 carriers left to his name: Enterprise, Hornet, and the wounded Yorktown, patched together in just 72 hours after the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was not enough to guarantee victory, but it was enough to fight. By late May, the Americans had quietly positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, hidden beneath a vast ocean. Every man aboard knew what was coming. On the decks of the Enterprise, pilots checked their aircraft again and again, wiping oil from their hands and fear from their faces. The air was heavy with tension, but beneath it ran a current of grim determination. At dawn on June 4, 1942, the lookouts on Midway Island spotted the first dark dots on the horizon, dozens of Japanese aircraft moving in formation. The attack had begun. Sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft guns thundered. Bombs rained down upon the tiny atoll, turning runways to fire and sand to smoke. The defenders fought back fiercely, but it was only the beginning. Far to the northeast, hidden in the blue vastness of the Pacific, 3 American carriers waited for their moment to strike. The trap had been set not by Yamamoto, but by Nimitz. The hunters of Pearl Harbor were about to become the hunted. In the final days of May 1942, the Pacific lay deceptively calm. Beneath that stillness, 2 fleets prepared for the most decisive battle in modern naval history. For the Japanese, victory seemed inevitable. Their empire stretched across 6,000 miles of ocean. Their ships had never known defeat, and their carrier pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and the Coral Sea, believed themselves invincible. Admiral Yamamoto's grand plan promised to destroy what remained of American naval power in one crushing blow. The plan was intricate, precise, and fatally overconfident. Yamamoto divided his forces into 4 massive groups scattered across thousands of miles. His carriers under Nagumo would strike Midway first, while a separate invasion fleet followed. To the north, another force would attack the Aleutians as a diversion. Yamamoto himself commanded the main battle fleet far to the rear, confident that the Americans would take the bait. The trap, as he saw it, was perfect, a chessboard of steel and deception. But while Japan plotted in secrecy, America was already listening. Deep in the basement of Pearl Harbor's intelligence center, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalysts had cracked Japan's naval code, JN-25. They worked in silence, surrounded by the hum of radio receivers and the smell of stale coffee. Every intercepted message, every fragment of code, brought them closer to the truth. When Rochefort confirmed that the mysterious target AF referred to Midway, his message went straight to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz did not hesitate. He knew the odds were against him. Japan's fleet outnumbered his by nearly 2-1, and their pilots were more experienced. But surprise was now his weapon. He ordered his 3 remaining carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, to rendezvous northeast of Midway. From there, he would ambush the Japanese fleet before they could strike again. On May 27th, Yorktown limped out of Pearl Harbor. She still bore the scars of coral sea decks torn. Bulkheads buckled, but her crew had performed a miracle. In just 3 days, shipyard workers restored her enough to fight. When she joined Enterprise and Hornet at Point Luck, the Americans had assembled the last line of defense between Japan and the West Coast. The men knew it. Pilots in the ready rooms studied maps and attack patterns by the light of red lamps. Mechanics worked without sleep, coaxing life into tired engines. On the flight decks, sailors chalked prayers onto bombs for Pearl Harbor, for the Arizona, for Dad. They were young, most barely out of school, but their faces carried the weight of a nation. Back in Tokyo, Admiral Nagumo reviewed his own attack plans aboard the carrier Akagi. He had no idea that American carriers were already waiting for him. His scouts would not find them until it was too late. The confidence of Pearl Harbor had become arrogance, and arrogance would soon meet its reckoning. The stage was set. 2 great fleets, unseen by each other, raced toward destiny. Between them lay a small coral atoll, its name known to few Midway, and by the time the sun set over that island, the balance of the Pacific would be forever changed. Dawn broke on June 4th, 1942, over a restless sea. On the flight decks of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, pilots climbed into cockpits, mechanics gave thumbs up, and engines began to roar in unison. Admiral Nagumo's first strike force, 108 planes strong, launched into the morning sky. Their target, Midway Atoll. The attack formation cut across the Pacific like a swarm of hornets. Sunlight glinted off silver wings and red circles as the armada of bombers and fighters descended upon the island. At 6:20 a.m., the first bombs fell. Explosions tore through the tiny airfield, sending shockwaves through the sand. The Marines defending Midway fired back with every gun they had: anti-aircraft batteries, rifles, even machine guns stripped from wrecked planes. The sky turned black with smoke and tracer fire. From the operations bunker, Commander Cyril Simard of Midway's air station watched the chaos unfold. His radio crackled with desperate reports: fuel tanks exploding, runways shattered, hangars engulfed in flame. Yet somehow, Midway's defenders refused to break. Even as the island burned, American aircraft scrambled into the air, their engines coughing through dust and debris. B-17. Flying fortresses lumbered into the sky, followed by marine dive bombers and torpedo planes. The Japanese, satisfied with the damage inflicted, turned back toward their carriers to prepare for a second strike. But as they recovered their planes, their greatest vulnerability was exposed. The decks of the four carriers became chaos aircraft, refueling, rearming, and crowding. The decks, flight decks with bombs and gasoline hoses. In that fragile window, Nagumo faced a decision that would define the battle. At 7:15 a.m., a scout plane from the cruiser Tone sent a belated report. Enemy ship sighted bearing 10 degrees. The message arrived late, but it changed everything. American carriers were not supposed to be there. Nagumo now had a choice: launch his second strike on Midway immediately or rearm his planes with torpedoes to attack the enemy fleet. He chose the latter. It was the decision that would seal his fate. While Japanese deck crews scrambled to change bomb loads, American forces struck back from the island. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Midway, flying outdated TBD Devastators, attacked through swarms of Zero fighters. One by one, they fell in flames. Of the entire squadron, only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived floating in the open sea, watching the battle unfold around him. Far to the northeast, hidden behind the horizon, 3 American carriers waited. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had launched their aircraft minutes earlier. Nearly 200 planes were now on their way, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters searching for Nagumo's fleet. The Japanese had no idea they were coming. Their decks were still cluttered, their crews still moving bombs and fuel. In the space of an hour, the hunter would become the hunted. Above Midway, the smoke thickened. The atoll still burned, but its defense had not been in vain. It had bought the one thing the Americans needed most: time. And time, in that hour, was worth an empire. The morning sun hung high over a calm Pacific when the trap was finally sprung. At 9:20 a.m., American carrier aircraft, scattered across the sea, began to converge on Nagumo's task force. They came in waves, tired, disorganized, and without coordination, yet each attack forced the Japanese to turn, dodge, and exhaust their fighter cover. The first to arrive were the torpedo squadrons from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown. 41 slow, outdated TBD Devastators droned toward the enemy fleet, flying barely above the waves. The pilots knew the odds. Against them waited 30 Zero fighters and walls of anti-aircraft fire. Still, they pressed on. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron of Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 led the first assault. His planes flew straight into the storm. Their guns silent, their torpedoes primed, Japanese fighters tore them apart in minutes. Waldron's radio crackled once: "We'll go in, we won't come back." Moments later, his plane exploded in flame and vanished into the sea. 15 planes went in, none returned. From Enterprise came Torpedo Squadron 6, led by Eugene Lindsay. Same courage, same fate. They attacked head-on, torpedoes streaking through the water toward Kaga and Akagi. Everyone missed. Every plane was shot down. Then came Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3. Only a handful made it close enough to drop their torpedoes, and even then, not one struck home. The sea was littered with burning wreckage and oil. Out of 41 torpedo planes, only 4 returned. It looked like disaster. The Japanese decks were untouched, their Zeros victorious, their commanders confident. But in their triumph, they never looked up. At 10:22 a.m., from 20,000 feet above, the real attack began. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had arrived unseen, undetected, and perfectly positioned above the Japanese fleet. Leading them was Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, whose decision moments earlier had changed history. Running low on fuel, he had spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing north at full speed. He followed it straight to Nagumo's carriers. Now, through his dive sight, McClusky saw the decks of Kaga crammed with aircraft, fuel lines snaking across them like veins. He rolled his Dauntless into a dive. The wind screamed past his cockpit as he dropped straight into the heart of the enemy fleet. The first bomb struck Kaga's flight deck near the island superstructure, detonating among parked aircraft. The next tore through the hangar deck, igniting torpedoes and gasoline. The entire ship erupted in a chain of explosions. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. Seconds later, Akagi was hit a single bomb, perfectly placed, tore through her flight deck and exploded amid refueling planes. Within minutes, both carriers were burning beyond control. To the east, Yorktown's dive bombers found Soryu. 3 bombs struck her amidships, turning the carrier into a furnace. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were ablaze, their crews throwing themselves overboard to escape the inferno. Nagumo watched in disbelief from his flagship as the sea that had once been his domain became a graveyard. The fleet that had humbled Pearl Harbor was dying before his eyes. At 10:30 a.m., the Pacific War changed forever. The morning that had begun with triumph now burned with ruin. By 10:30, 3 of Japan's proudest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were infernos on the sea. Their flight decks buckled, their hangars exploded in rolling fire, and their crews fought hopelessly to save them. Admiral Nagumo, once the hunter, now stood surrounded by wreckage. Yet in the midst of disaster, one carrier still floated Hiryu. Aboard Hiryu, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi refused to surrender. He was a warrior of the old school, calm and precise, his uniform immaculate, even as smoke from the burning horizon drifted toward him. When word came that 3 carriers were lost, he did not curse or falter. He simply said, "Then we will strike back." At 10:50 a.m., Hiryu launched her first counterstrike. 18 dive bombers and 6 Zeros roared off her deck, flying toward the last known position of the American fleet. Guided by scattered reports, they found Yorktown just after noon. The carrier's decks were alive with activity planes, refueling, gunners at their posts, sailors bracing for the inevitable. From the clouds above, the Japanese attack began. The first bomb tore through Yorktown's flight deck near amidships, exploding in the hangar below. Flames and smoke billowed skyward. A second bomb hit forward, blowing a hole through the deck and scattering wreckage into the sea. The third missed, but the shock waves twisted steel and ruptured fuel lines. Within minutes, Yorktown was burning. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding from the bridge, fought to save her. Damage control teams raced through smoke-filled corridors, sealing bulkheads and flooding magazines. Fire hoses hissed across the deck. The carrier listed heavily to port, then slowly righted as pumps roared to life. By 1:30, the fires were under control. Against all odds, Yorktown survived. But Hiryu was not done. At 2:30 p.m., Yamaguchi launched a second wave, 10 torpedo planes and 6 escorts. They came in low, just above the waves, dodging flak bursts and fighter fire. The American Wildcats shot down many, but 4 broke through. The first torpedo struck Yorktown amidships on her port side, tearing open a massive hole below the waterline. A second followed seconds later, hitting almost the same spot. The great carrier shuddered, slowed, and began to list again. Water poured in faster than the pumps could handle. The engines stopped. The order came: abandon ship. As men slid down ropes into the oil-slicked sea, they looked back and saw the flag still flying. Yorktown drifted silently, her decks awash, smoke rising into the sky. For the second time in one day, they had fought her to the limit. Far away, Admiral Nimitz received the reports. His carriers had struck a crippling blow, but the Japanese still had fight left. 3 carriers were gone, but Hiryu still proud, vengeful, and unbroken. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the Pacific. Both fleets were battered, both bloodied. But before the day was done, one more giant would fall. The Pacific sun was sinking toward the horizon when the Americans finally found her, the last of Nagumo's carriers. Hiryu, wounded but unbowed, still launching planes into the dying light. The sea around her shimmered with heat and oil, littered with debris from 3 lost sisters. Smoke from Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu drifted like black banners across the water, a grim reminder of the Empire's arrogance. Yet Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi refused to retreat. His orders were simple: fight until nothing remained. By late afternoon, reconnaissance from Enterprise spotted her. A single PBY Catalina had shadowed the Japanese fleet for hours, finally transmitting the coordinates position confirmed. 1 carrier still operational. Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise didn't hesitate. He turned his flagship into the wind and gave the order that would end the battle. At 4 p.m., 32 SBD, dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown took to the sky. Led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence McClusky and Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, the pilots flew in silence, the ocean stretching endlessly below. They knew the target, waiting ahead, the last carrier of Pearl Harbor's killers. The men carried the ghosts of Arizona, Lexington, and Yorktown with them. Every pound of ordnance was personal. When they reached Hiryu, the scene was almost unreal. She sailed alone, amid drifting smoke, her deck slick with fuel, her crew racing to recover the few planes still airborne. Fighters scrambled to meet the attack, but they were too few. At 5:03 p.m., the Dauntlesses rolled over and began their dives. The first bombs fell like judgment. One hit forward of the island, tearing through the flight deck and exploding deep inside the hangar. The second struck near the aft elevator, igniting torpedoes and aircraft fuel. The third smashed directly into the midsection, where planes were being rearmed. Within seconds, the deck became a sheet of fire. The explosions spread fast. Flames raced through every corridor, licking across steel and swallowing men in smoke. The heat grew so intense that ammunition began to detonate on its own. Crews tried to fight back, fire hoses snaking through the inferno, men passing buckets of water hand to hand, but it was hopeless. The carrier that had struck Yorktown now burned brighter than the sun. On the bridge, Admiral Yamaguchi stood beside Captain Tomio Kaku. The ship was lost. Both men knew it. Yet when the order to abandon ship was given, Yamaguchi refused. He removed his cap, straightened his uniform, and said quietly, "We will go down with our ship." Captain Kaku nodded. Together, they remained on the bridge as Hiryu burned beneath them. By evening, she was dead in the water, her engines silent, her decks collapsing inward. At 8 p.m., she exploded a final roar that rolled across the sea like thunder. When the smoke cleared, only a glowing patch of oil and a few scattered survivors remained. The last carrier of the Pearl Harbor strike force was gone. In one day, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 300 planes, and the irreplaceable pilots who had once ruled the skies. As night fell over the Pacific, the hunters of December 7th were no more. The tide had turned, and the age of the rising sun was beginning to fade. When darkness fell across the Pacific on June 4th, 1942, the sea was littered with wreckage. Flames from the dying Japanese carriers still glowed faintly on the horizon, reflected in the calm waters like embers from a dying fire. The thunder of guns was gone, replaced by the low hiss of burning oil and the faint cries of men clinging to the sea. For the survivors, both Japanese and American, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Aboard Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge, staring into the black expanse. He had won one of the greatest naval victories in history, yet there was no celebration. Below decks, the air still reeked of sweat and cordite. Pilots returned from their missions white-faced and trembling. Many had not come back at all. Of the 233 aircraft launched that morning, nearly a third had been lost. The ready rooms were half empty. Empty chairs, unclaimed helmets, and silent lockers told their own story. Yorktown was still afloat barely. After the second torpedo strike, she had been abandoned, listing heavily and drifting without power. Yet she refused to sink. The destroyer Haman came alongside to assist with repairs, her crew working tirelessly to keep Yorktown alive. Men crossed planks between the two ships, carrying hoses, cables, and hope. But fate had not finished with her yet. On the afternoon of June 6th, as the damaged carrier and her escort drifted under a gray sky, the Japanese submarine, I-168, found them. Moving silently through the depths, she fired a spread of torpedoes. One struck Hammond amidships, breaking her in half. Two more slammed into Yorktown. The destroyer went down in 4 minutes, her depth charges exploding as she sank, killing dozens in the water. Yorktown lingered for another day, her battle flag still flying high. Then, in the early hours of June 7th, she rolled slowly onto her side and slipped beneath the waves. The Americans had lost one carrier and a destroyer, a painful cost, but nothing compared to what they had gained. Japan's carrier strike force, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was gone. The veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor were dead or captured, their experience irreplaceable. For the first time since the war began, Japan's expansion had been stopped cold. On Midway Island, the surviving Marines walked among the smoking craters of their airfield. The wrecks of shattered planes lay twisted in the sand. They had buried their dead quickly, wrapped in canvas, marked by simple wooden crosses. Over the radio, they heard the impossible news: the Japanese fleet destroyed. The men stared at one another in disbelief. For Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, the message from Spruance was simple. Which had seemed lost 6 months before was now an open door. The road to Tokyo was still long and bloody, but at Midway, America had stopped running. And in that silence after the storm, history itself began to turn. News of the victory at Midway reached Pearl Harbor in the early hours of June 7, 1942. The coded transmissions came slowly at first, each confirmation carrying the weight of disbelief. 4 enemy carriers destroyed. In the communications center, weary operators stared at the messages, trying to grasp what it meant. 6 months earlier, the rising sun had seemed unstoppable. Now, the tide of the Pacific War had begun to shift quietly, but irrevocably. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz received the final report aboard his flagship, Enterprise. He read it twice, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "This changes everything." For the first time since the war began, he allowed himself a brief smile. The men around him didn't cheer. They simply nodded. They knew what it had cost to earn that line of victory. Across the ocean, America listened. The first radio bulletins spoke cautiously: U.S. forces turn back, Japanese attack at Midway, but by nightfall, the truth spread across every newspaper in the nation. Headlines screamed of a miracle. Crowds gathered outside newsstands. In factories and small towns, people read the reports aloud, shaking their heads in awe. Mothers who had prayed for their sons at sea wept quietly. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, there was hope. Yet for the men who had fought, victory carried a different taste. On Enterprise, sailors still scrubbed the flight deck clean of blood and oil. Pilots counted the names of those who had not returned, friends who had vanished into the sea without a trace. Mechanics worked through the night, repairing bullet-riddled aircraft, their faces expressionless, their hands trembling. They knew the war was far from over. For Japan, the news struck like a thunderclap. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy tried to hide the extent of the disaster, but word spread quickly through whispers. 4 of their 6 main carriers were gone. Hundreds of veteran pilots were dead men who had trained for years, irreplaceable in both skill and spirit. Admiral Yamamoto, stunned and humiliated, reportedly bowed his head in silence upon hearing the news. His brilliant plan, meant to destroy America's resolve, had instead destroyed his own fleet. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the coded summary in the Oval Office. He leaned back in his chair, his face solemn. "This isn't just a victory," he said softly. "It's a beginning." Advisors around him nodded. For the first time, the United States could think beyond defense. Factories across the country roared to life. Aircraft plants doubled production. New carriers Essex, Intrepid, Bunker Hill were already on the drawing boards. The miracle of Midway had proven that the Japanese Navy could bleed, and once that truth was known, there would be no turning back. Midway was not the end. It was the awakening. The island was small, the battle brief, but the echoes of those 4 sunken carriers would be heard across the world. The Pacific had shifted, the hunter had become the hunted, and America, bloodied and unbroken, had finally stood up. In the days that followed the Battle of Midway, the Pacific Ocean lay strangely quiet. The sea that had thundered with bombs and fire was now a graveyard, a calm expanse beneath which the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rested side by side. Oil slicks stretched for miles, and scattered debris, a broken wing, a floating life jacket, a prayer book drifted aimlessly on the waves. Above, the gulls circled and cried, their voices the only sound left from a battle that had changed the course of history. For the Americans, the victory was as sobering as it was glorious. Admiral Nimitz called it a remarkable success, but he also knew the truth. Luck had played its part. Had McClusky not followed that lone Japanese destroyer, had the torpedo squadrons not drawn the Zero fighters low, had the dive bombers arrived even 5 minutes later, the outcome might have been very different. The battle had balanced on the edge of fate. The crews who had attacked Pearl Harbor, the most skilled aviators in the world, were gone. The Japanese could build new ships, but they could not replace those men. It was a wound that would never fully heal. In Tokyo, the news was buried beneath silence. The Imperial Navy issued vague statements, claiming a glorious engagement near Midway. Only the highest officials knew the truth. Admiral Yamamoto, once hailed as invincible, withdrew into seclusion. His dream of crushing the American fleet had vanished beneath the waves he had once ruled. Privately, he said, "I feared all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant." He had been right. Across the Pacific, the United States was already changing. The factories of Detroit and Seattle ran day and night, churning out planes, engines, and ships at a pace Japan could not match. New pilots, trained by the thousands, new carriers Essex, Yorktown II, Princeton, Wasp II, slid down the ways in gleaming paint and steel. The spirit of defeat that had hung over Pearl Harbor was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. But the victory at Midway came at a cost measured in lives. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8, all but one lost. The Marines who died defending the island. The sailors who went down with Yorktown and Hammond. They were the price of the turning tide. On the decks of the surviving carriers, memorial services were held at sunset. Chaplains read from the Book of Psalms as the Pacific breeze carried the words away. Hats were removed, heads bowed, and wreaths cast upon the water. For those who had fought, Midway was more than a battle. It was a test of endurance, faith, and courage. They had faced impossible odds and won, not through strength alone, but through resilience. As Enterprise and Hornet turned east toward Pearl Harbor, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ocean in gold. The war was far from over, but for the first time, the path ahead was clear. Midway had ended an empire's advance and awakened another's resolve. Behind every explosion, every maneuver, every victory at Midway stood men whose courage shaped the outcome of the Pacific War. They were sailors, pilots, and mechanics. Ordinary Americans who had become extraordinary through necessity. Most were barely 20, their faces still boyish, their hearts hardened by loss. They had watched Pearl Harbor burn. And now, 6 months later, they had struck back with everything they had left. On the flight decks of Enterprise and Hornet, the heroes of Midway walked among the wrecks of their own planes. Many returned with bullet holes in their wings, their landing gear shattered, their fuel tanks dry. Some limped home on fumes, guided only by instinct and prayer. When their wheels finally touched the deck, ground crews cheered, but those cheers were brief. There were too many who didn't come back. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, whose decision to follow a lone Japanese destroyer had led him straight to Nagumo's carriers, was among the quietest of heroes. When asked later how he had known which direction to go, he shrugged and said, "Just trusted my gut." His calm instinct had turned the tide of the Pacific. Lieutenant Richard Best, who scored the fatal hits on both Akagi and Hiryu, had fought through pain and smoke to complete his dives. His oxygen system had malfunctioned during the attack, burning his lungs with pure gas. He landed barely conscious, his body broken, his shipmates pulling him from the cockpit. He would never fly again, but his bombs had changed the war. There was Ensign George Gay, the lone survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, who had watched the entire battle from the ocean after his squadron was wiped out. Floating amid oil and wreckage, he saw the Japanese carriers burn, his friends sacrifice, buying the time the dive bombers needed to strike. His courage became the symbol of every man who fought, knowing he might not live to see victory. On Midway itself, the Marines had stood their ground under impossible conditions. They fought from shattered bunkers, firing anti-aircraft guns until the barrels glowed red. The island's runways were cratered, fuel tanks burning, yet they refused to retreat. Many of the defenders were killed at their posts, still gripping the triggers of their guns. And then there were the nameless, the mechanics who patched bullet-riddled wings, the sailors who dragged wounded comrades from burning decks, the radio operators who relayed life and death messages through static and smoke. History would not remember all their names, but without them, there would have been no Midway. After the battle, Admiral Nimitz said, "It was the men, not the machines, that won it." He was right. The aircraft were fragile, the ships scarred, and the odds impossible. Yet the human spirit proved stronger than steel. In the glow of sunset, with the Pacific calm once more, the surviving men stood on deck and looked toward the west. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Japan, still powerful, still defiant. But they no longer feared it. They had fought the Empire's best and won. The tide had turned, because ordinary men had done the impossible. Months after the smoke cleared over Midway, the meaning of the battle began to surface, not just in military reports, but in the quiet reflection of those who had lived through it. The Pacific Ocean, vast and indifferent, had swallowed 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, and thousands of men. But beneath that loss lay revelation. The empire that had seemed invincible was mortal after all, and the world had witnessed the moment it began to bleed. For the United States, Midway was more than a victory of ships and planes. It was a triumph of intelligence, timing, and nerve. In the quiet rooms of Pearl Harbor, the codebreakers of Station Hypo had turned radios and typewriters into weapons more powerful than bombs. Commander Joseph Rochefort, often overlooked and always underestimated, had read the enemy's intentions before they struck. Without his brilliance, Yamamoto's plan might have succeeded. His team's quiet triumph became the unseen cornerstone of Midway's miracle. On the other side of the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto studied the reports in silence. He had risked everything on one grand trap, and it had consumed his best men. He knew the truth: Japan's industrial might could never match America's. The empire had one chance to win: swift, decisive victories that would break the enemy's spirit. Midway had been that chance, and it was gone. He is said to have remarked to his staff, "After Midway, we will never again be on the offensive." His prediction proved prophetic. In Washington, military strategists dissected every detail of the battle. They saw not just courage, but the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one fought not by battleships, but by aircraft carriers, where distance and timing replaced armor and gunfire. The age of naval aviation had arrived. The lessons of Midway became doctrine, studied by every young officer who would one day command a fleet. But for those who had fought, the lessons were personal. Pilots who survived spoke of instinct, luck, and faith. Sailors remembered the chaos of burning decks, the screams through smoke, the stillness that followed. Many never spoke of it again. They carried the battle quietly. Within them, its ghosts, its guilt, its glory. At Pearl Harbor, Enterprise limped into port to the cheers of thousands. Her hull bore shrapnel scars. Her decks were blackened and bent. Yet to the men watching from the shore, she was a symbol not just of victory, but of survival. In the barracks that night, sailors read the casualty lists under dim lights. Some found names they'd prayed not to see. Others traced their fingers over familiar handwriting on dog tags returned from the sea. Midway had been won not by perfection, but by persistence, by men who refused to yield, by leaders who dared to gamble, by a nation that chose defiance over despair. And as the world turned toward the next battles, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Leyte, the revelation of Midway remained clear. Empires fall not only to might, but to resilience, to intelligence, to the quiet courage of those who stand their ground when everything seems lost. The hunters had become the hunted, and history had found its turning point. Years after the guns fell silent, the name Midway still carried the weight of destiny. It was more than a battle, it was the moment when the world changed course. In a war defined by chaos and loss, Midway became the word that meant hope. It was the day the rising sun began to set, and the United States, bloodied but unbroken, began its long march across the Pacific. For the men who survived, life after Midway was quieter, but never the same. Many returned to new ships and new battles: Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Okinawa, carrying the memory of that June morning like a shadow. Others went home, their youth burned away over the blue vastness of the Pacific. They tried to build lives in peace, but in their dreams, they still heard the scream of engines, the rush of wind in a dive, the thunder of guns echoing through the clouds. At reunions years later, the veterans spoke little of heroism. They talked, instead of luck, of how close the world had come to a different fate. They remembered friends who had vanished into the sea, faces half remembered in the glow of sunset over the flight deck. They knew that their victory had been bought not only with courage, but with sacrifice beyond measure. Admiral Nimitz, reflecting on the battle long after the war, said it simply, "Midway was the turning point. Up to that time, we were on the defensive. After Midway, we were on the attack." His words captured what the Pacific Fleet had become, a force reborn from the ashes of Pearl Harbor, guided by hard lessons and an unbreakable will. The carriers that survived, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown's legacy, became the backbone of a new navy, one that would carry the fight to Japan's doorstep. On the Japanese side, Midway was remembered in silence and regret. Survivors of the lost carriers spoke of fire and confusion, of comrades who chose the sea rather than capture. Admiral Yamamoto, haunted by the defeat, continued to lead his forces until his death a year later, shot down over Bougainville. His dream of a Pacific empire had died the moment the bombs fell upon Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. In the decades that followed, divers and explorers found the wrecks resting in the deep, silent monuments to courage and consequence. 2,000 feet beneath the surface, the twisted hulls of those carriers still lay side by side, their decks covered in coral and sand. They are neither triumphs nor tombs now, but reminders that even the strongest fleets can fall, and that the sea remembers everything. At the U.S. Naval Academy, new officers still study Midway not as legend, but as lesson. They learn how courage and calculation can rewrite the impossible. They learn how a handful of men and machines, armed with faith and fire, can alter the fate of nations. Midway was not the end, but the beginning of the end. It was the day when the course of the war and of history itself turned in America's favor. And somewhere beyond the waves, where the sunlight fades into the deep, the ghosts of that battle still keep their watch, forever guarding the place where the tide of the Pacific began to change.